Hello and welcome back. So, I've decided to do a reread for this one, and it's The Master and Margarita, which is a modern classic Russian literature. I'm in the height of my grad school semester, and I thought, what's gonna help me get through this other than Russian literature with some magical realism that I got really confused by when I was 17. So that's the choice that I have decided to make. But I do want to talk about my history with this book because, as I mentioned, it's a reread. So I picked this up when I was around, I think, 17, and I was in London. And I actually still have the bookmark from the original store. It's Brick Lane Bookshop, in case anyone was wondering that. So I picked it up there because, as you can see by the cover, there's a giant black cat. And I love cats, as we know. Leo's in the background there. And I read the back, and I was like, oh, there's a huge black cat and it talks. Great. So all those things combined, I was like, this will be perfect for me. But I didn't know anything about really Russian history at that point, other than the fact that like the Soviet Union existed and that I read Animal Farm one time. But like anything beyond that, I didn't know. I didn't know anything about like surrealism or anything along those lines. And to be honest, I still don't really know a ton about that. But I'm thinking now that I'm at the riper age of like 26, maybe I'll have a little bit better grasp on this than I did when I was 17. And I just kind of got to the point where I was like, I just want to finish this. And I kind of just skimmed and nothing really clicked up there. And the thing is that my roommate in college read it. I don't remember when, it was probably like her junior year or something. And she came downstairs and she was like, this book is really good. And I was like, really? I don't know, maybe you need some years to mature for some things. And also, she is probably way more adept with Russian literature than I am, or was at least at the time, because she had read some other like Russian authors. But yeah, so that's what we're gonna do. It's probably gonna take me a lot longer than some other reading vlogs that I've done, just because, again, grad school. And I'm gonna try not to rant too much about how much I don't want to deal with grad school right now, because that's not why we're here. But just to note that, like, if you probably can't see the calendar back there, but it says that it's February. And by the time that I get done with this, it's not going to be anywhere near February. Looking forward to it, and we'll see how it goes. Hello, okay, so I'm coming in with an update. I'm now close to 100 pages in and like about a fourth of the way through the book. So before I even like actually talk about what I've read so far, I'm gonna first try to contextualize what this book is and when it was written and why it was written. So as I mentioned, it's Russian literature and it's around the Soviet Union time. So it was actually written from like in the 1930s, but then it wasn't published until the mid 60s, and even then they still had to censor it a little bit, and I don't know when the full like uncensored version was published, but basically, all to say, this was written during Stalin's reign, and it couldn't actually be published until after Stalin's reign because of like regulations. A lot of it is really focused on critiquing Stalin, so I feel like we have to talk about Stalin before we can really even get into the book, which, as I said, I don't know a ton about Russian history, but I was a history minor and we did have to take survey classes. So I took the 2 European survey classes, and one of them was from 1789, which is the French Revolution, usually is like the start date of that, through the present. And we did have like a whole chunk that was really focused on Russia, which was roughly like around the 1890s through to World War II. And I was luckily able to find my notes from this time. So I'm gonna go over some of those bullet points and just kind of like, is this gonna be eloquently put? No, but this is just like basically my notes from sophomore year of college. And I guess the chapter that we were doing was called Stalinism as a Civilization, and like that's a cool name. So let's appreciate that. But it says that it's from 1982. Wait, hold on. I got my numbers backwards. 1928 through 1939. So I guess that was when Stalin was reigning. I hope. Okay, so I have a bullet point about the Great Depression, just to note like that was happening around this time and that does impact things. Some people believe in the USSR and do believe that the communist mission, but others see through the mirage large amounts of optimism with a lurking anxiety. That feels significant. Okay, so it says the party must control the economy and people's perceptions. That's also kind of a big theme in the book too. Cultural Revolution lists the arts to produce socialist realism, which is celebrate the contributions of ordinary people that give to the party / the overall vision. So in this last bullet point, the Great Purges, people arrested for crimes against the state, one of the many terrorizing optics for the people. State terror doesn't matter who you are, it matters who the state thinks you are. And I think that that's kind of a theme in the book. People lived with a gambler's mentality. The society becomes paranoid because of the state. Until 1936, communist members were safe from these terror campaigns, but the Great Purge turned the campaign to inside the party to purify it. The old Bolsheviks party members are gone after this. Stalin has more loyal and ignorant staff. So that's my notes from like sophomore year. So I have forgotten most of this information, so I can't really contextualize it too much beyond just the notes. But I am going to go through some of the themes that I kind of brought up in my notes that I think you can link to at least like the first couple of chapters in the foundation that it's building. Okay, so the thing with this book is that there's a couple different storylines that are happening that they switch back and forth depending on what chapter you're in. So I think that there's 3 in total, but at this point I only have 2 going. So the first one, and this is the opening chapter, you have this one guy who is the editor of a magazine, and then you have this other guy that's a poet. And the editor asks the poet to do a work that is like basically anti-religious, pro atheism, something like that. So basically like the Cultural Revolution bullet point that I mentioned of like enlisting artists to kind of like help create the vision that Stalin was wanting to create for his regime. And within that chapter, we can maybe see some like policing of the press sort of situation, because, well, not only are they commissioning like a very specific topic and work to better the perception of the party, but there also is like this stranger that comes up during their conversation, and he has an accent, so they assume that he's German, and he has like a mysterious air about him, but somehow knows a lot of things, and he's called the Professor. And the thing is that like he's actually the devil in this, baseline story, but they don't know that. So the poet pulls the editor aside and says he's not just a foreign tourist, he's a spy. He's a Russian something that I can't pronounce, and he's trying to catch us. So I thought that like that was just kind of like a little mark that I was like, okay, maybe there is a little bit of like policing of the press sort of thing, because when we think about a lot of like dictatorships and things of that nature, we tend to think about like, for us, like the First Amendment rights being taken away. So I try to like look for moments of that. But then the second storyline is about a Jesus character and Pontius Pilate. So the professor says like, oh, I mean, you can argue that there is no proof of God, but like Jesus did exist, and I have that proof, and then starts telling like the tale of Pontius Pilate and what he witnessed. So like even within that storyline, you can kind of see the critique of the Russian environment, politics. Basically what happened is that, I'm just going to call him Jesus, even though that's not what they call him, but it is basically a stand-in for Jesus. So Jesus is captured and is like in front of Pontius Pilate, and Pontius Pilate is like, what did you do? Like, how did you get in this situation? So, and they just call him the prisoner right now. So, among the other things I said, continue the prisoner, that all power is a form of violence exercised over people, and that the time will come when there will be no rule by Caesar, nor any other form of rule. Man will pass into the kingdom of truth and justice, where no sort of power will be needed. I'm turning the page. Go on. There is no more to tell, said the prisoner. After that, some men came running in and tied me up and took me to prison. So I think that there is kind of like the whole great purges element there, where it is like basically just policing people that don't agree with him, or gives like other views that aren't approved by the party. I think that it's interesting that they're kind of using Caesar as like a stand-in for Stalin, I think, in this certain storyline. And we haven't circled back to that storyline so far in the part that I'm in, but I'm pretty sure that we do continue that one a little later on. And then, like I said, I think there's like another third storyline that comes in at some point. But you know, that's the thing. When I'm like 1/4 of the way through a book, it's always so hard for me to like give thoughts, because we're still so fresh in the beginning, and you're like, what are the themes going to be? And the things that you think are significant now, yeah, they're significant, but then you get all further and you're like halfway through the book and you're like, whoa, there are so many other things at that point that were way more significant than what I had mentioned earlier. Like, it really is a mind boggle. So that's why I'm like, let me just focus on like the first 2 chapters and what might be some parallels of like what the author is critiquing when it comes, or satirizing, because this is a satirical novel with like the Russian party. I don't know, half of the struggle of this is just going to be me trying to figure out the terminology of like what to call Stalinism, just to like say a little bit more about what is actually happening in the plot at this point, just to contextualize some things if needed. Okay, so you did have the whole like professor and he coming up to the poet, and during their conversation the professor's like, oh, by the way, editor, you're gonna die by having like your head severed off. And the editor's like, that's so interesting. And then at some point the editor's like, you know, this guy's kind of weird, and like I think we need to call a version of the police or some kind of entity that like deals with foreign tourists. So then he like sneaks off to try to use the phone, but as he's going to try to use the phone, he trips on some oil and then falls into like the street to where the tram is going, and then his head gets severed. So basically that all comes to light, and then the poet runs out and sees that that's what happened, and he's freaking out because he's like, well, 1, my friend is dead, and 2, the professor was right. And so then he starts to try to like run after the professor to try to get him arrested. And then at some point, I think he jumps into a lake. Somehow he loses all of his clothes, basically. And I think it's because he like strips, jumps into a lake, and then comes back out, and then someone like took his clothes, or he only has part of his clothes. Basically, he's running around the streets in his underwear now. So now that he's running around the streets in his underwear, you know, that's not the thing that you want to be doing in Russia under any circumstances, but especially not in a totalitarian regime that is basically Stalinism. So then he goes to like this writers club, and he's like, please let me in, they've murdered the editor, everything is terrible. And you do have like a passage that describes the writers club, which is kind of fun. But anyway, so then the writers club is like, oh my gosh, also, why are you naked? And he's like, there's so much to say, and we cannot focus on this, but also if anyone has any clothes, that would be great. So they just didn't really know what to do with this guy, so they're like, let's just call the doctor. So now he's kind of in like an insane asylum or something to that degree. So now he's locked up, and what the professor's been doing in the meantime is that he goes to the editor's house, and I think it's like maybe a roommate situation, or just someone that also lives in the same apartment complex. I don't really know the setup of things, but basically, there's another guy that is in the editor's general house. And so then the professor kills him, and that's just kind of where we're at right now. Basically, the professor is still at large, and the black cat comes and goes as he pleases, as cats do. And the poet, whose first name I believe is Ivan, is locked up in an insane asylum. So that's where we're at. So that's just like the first quarter of the novel so far. Obviously, I'll give an update, and hopefully, I do a little bit better with getting clips. Because every single time, I just forget to get clips a lot. Welcome back to Floor Time. I made it through part 1 of the book because this book is split into 2 sections. And I'm not going to go too much into details about the summary or the plot just because it's getting really convoluted and it's hard to try to summarize that in a coherent way, which I think will be fine because I think the summary that I gave previously is pretty much the foundation that you'll probably need to understand what I'm going to be talking about. But to start off, reading the novel has felt kind of similar to me to how I felt when I was reading Dracula. And the main reason for that is because you do have multiple points of view, but kind of indirectly. So with a lot of like modern POV style novels, you have like a chapter and then the name of the character, and then it's like I, blah, 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 blah. You have the next chapter, a name of a different character, and it's like I, blah, 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 blah. So it's very like first person, but like multiple perspectives. With this, it's a little bit more indirect. So, like with Dracula, for instance, everything is done through documentation. So, like the first part of the novel is like Jonathan's diary is what you're looking at, but then you start to get like telegrams or letters from one character to another character, and like that's how the narration's formed. With this, though, it's more of like you have multiple perspectives told through like an omnipotent narrator, and it's like you might have multiple perspectives of the same scene from different characters, or you might have one scene with one character and then it talks about what's happening at the same exact time with another character. So that's how you have like multiple layers to the story, which again makes it kind of difficult to actually explain. Another comparison that I've kind of made between Dracula and this novel is the use of the trope of the monster as a tool for social commentary in the narrative. So with Dracula, it's more of like obviously a vampire, and like the whole anxiety around foreignness and East versus West, and like a lot of that like Victorian anxiety. With this, the monster is the devil and his demons, and there is some aspect of like fear around foreignness happening, but there's also like something else that's happening in the background with these characters that's a theme, and I just haven't figured out what it is yet. And I might, or I might not. But just know that I'm not necessarily saying that like the monsters are being used to draw out the same themes in both of these novels, but that the trope of the monster is being used to create narrative themes or to better explore narrative themes or social commentary within these novels. So, but the thing is that the actual novel draws more comparison directly with Faust, which Faust is a German folk character that basically makes a deal with the devil. And that it's also another trope, really. I'm gonna link somewhere a video essay by Overly Sarcastic Productions, which goes into what a Faustian bargain is. I think it's Faustian bargain is, and how it's been used throughout history, different variations of it. It does a lot better job than what I can personally do, but like that resource will be there if you would like to explore more. But I am going to read the passage from the book that mentions this comparison and also give a little bit of context behind that. And then I'll go into a little bit more about like what I think that means or how that's being used in this novel. Okay, so I think I left off mentioning that the poet is in an insane asylum. That's such a hard word for me to say right now. After seeing the editor die / his head cut off. So what's happening in this chapter is a mysterious man climbs through the poet's window. I almost said wall. Not that crazy. He climbs through the window, a much more sane path, and they're having a little conversation, and they both knew the editor. So in this conversation, this mysterious man said, "Forgive me, but have you seen the opera Faust?" The poet mumbled in an embarrassment excuse. There you are, it's not surprising, but as I said before, I'm surprised at the editor. He's not only well-read, but extremely cunning. I think although in his use of the Faustian bargain in this is that usually it's an illusion of power, because the power isn't something that the person who made the bargain has. It's borrowed, and they're not necessarily the source, they're more like a vessel, and it can be taken away at like any time. So I think there's probably parallels with Stalin's inner circle and his use of the artist class, who are a lot of the main characters of the story. So like writers and poets and editors and novelists, and there's also like a group of theater people. So just like the fact that Stalin is giving them oh my god. I probably should drink water when I do these things. But anyways, Stalin is basically giving them this power of either publishing or creating or producing something to visibility, anything like that. But it's only going to last as long as he sees value of these goods or these productions to his propaganda or his party or whatever. So basically it's all a very temporary power. It can be taken away at any moment, but the artists that are in these positions probably don't feel like it's a borrowed power and that this is like their chance to write, produce, create, whatever, but it all has to be in the name of the party. It's not true like freedom or expression or anything like that. So I think that's like one of the areas that we're seeing this parallel between Stalin's regime and this idea of a Faustian bargain or Faust, and a lot of the themes of that particular, I guess, opera. I didn't realize it was an opera. And also like this particular edition of the book does have a quote from Faust in it in the very beginning, and I don't know if that's like standard or if that's just this one, but I am gonna go ahead and read it. So it says, "Say at last who art thou, that power I serve, which wills forever evil, yet does forever good." Don't know what that means at this time, but it could be something, I guess. Also within that same scene, another thing that's probably important to mention is that this mysterious visitor is a novelist who tried to write the story of Pontius Pilate similar to what the professor told the editor and the poet at the beginning of it. He doesn't necessarily identify as a novelist at this point because, and let me read this dialogue really quick. The visitor says, "The fact is that a year ago I wrote a novel about Pilate. Are you a writer?" asked the poet with interest. The visitor frowned, threatened Ivan with his fist, and said, "I am a master," which is the master of the beginning title of this. And he does kind of mention a mistress, but you don't know that it's Margarita at this time, but I did flip ahead a little bit and I saw that the next chapter is titled Margarita. So we, in part one, have been introduced to the master, and in part two, we will be introduced to Margarita, is where it seems to be going. But I'm going to go ahead and end this little briefing here. That's kind of what I got for right now. Okay, so I have finished the second book, and I'm gonna give some final thoughts soon. And just so you know, every single time that I do these videos, I usually do them about 3 times because I don't write like a script, I write notes. And sometimes thinking off the cuff, it just doesn't go well. And usually by like the 3rd or 4th try, it goes a little bit better. But anyways, just an insight into my creative process. So the second book is a lot more fun than the first book. There's less like layering of narratives, so it gets a little bit quicker pace, and you have like a lot more with the devil and his demons. And I do like the cat still, partly because he's like a trickster archetype, which I'm kind of always a sucker for, so can't go wrong with that. And the book does start with Margarita, and she becomes a witch, and then like flies to the devil, and then they have like a ball, and by the way, she's naked the entire time. And then the devil's like, well, since you did something for me, I'll do something for you, a deal with the devil. And she's like, well, I would really like the master not in an asylum and with me. And he was like, okay, done. So then the master comes back, and you do see like a series of like, oh, this is what happened to all the people that the devil displaced and how they got back and all of that. And I think that's kind of like alluding to the great purges of just the whole like disappearing and then eventually maybe sometimes getting to a return, but not always. And then you also have like an ending scene of the master and Margarita and what happened to them, which is ultimately to go and rest in peace with the devil, which sounds a little odd because that's not what you usually think of when you think of devil and resting in peace. But there's a scene that I'm going to read in a little bit that kind of explains like why that decision, well, not why that decision was made, was just like the fact that that decision was made. And if people have thoughts on that, that would be great, because I don't really know what it means, but I did think it was an interesting little note of things. But I did want to read one other excerpt from this portion of the book because I think it really relates to one of the notes that I mentioned earlier on about it doesn't matter who you are, it matters who the state thinks you are. And we see that with a little fun trip with the cat and then one of the other demons. And maybe I won't read the whole excerpt, but basically like they are going into a writer's club, and the woman that's kind of like the bouncer is like, show me your membership cards. And they're like, we don't have membership cards. And then one of the demons goes on a whole like monologue about, you know, really what is a writer? Is it someone who just has a membership card, or is it someone who thinks with their mind and puts it on paper and so on and so forth? So I do think that that's like definitely an example of that theme, but I think it speaks to a wider theme of like, what is a writer, or what is a creative, or what is an artist, which we'll dive into in a second. But first, I do want to read the excerpt that I mentioned about the decision for Margarita and the master to go with the devil. Okay, so for context, this narrative doesn't necessarily have a Peter character, but rather Peter is Matthew, and I don't know why, but I'm not a theologist. But just so you know, basically Matthew is coming to speak to the professor, the devil, and he says, Jesus has read the master's writings and asks you take the master with you and reward him by granting him peace. Would that be hard for you to do, spirit of evil? Nothing is hard for me to do, replied the devil, as you well know. He paused for a while and then added, why don't you take him yourself to the light? He has not earned light, he has earned rest, said Matthew. So, that's not normally like the imagery that we think of when it comes to like resting, our final resting. Like, it's usually like seeing the light, and then on the other side of that light, it's implied that you are at peace or at rest. But in this narrative, it seems that the light is something else, and that rest and peace is actually something that the devil has some kind of domain over. So again, I don't know what that means. And maybe that's a thing of like, good versus evil. It's not black and white. It's more nuanced of that, because we do see like basically Jesus' right-hand man and the devil having like a pretty civil conversation, and the devil basically just doing what Jesus tells him to do. But also, maybe there's something here of satirizing with the whole like rest being something of the devil, because we've demonized rest so much. And I'm sure in a like rapidly industrialized society that like Stalin was aiming for, I'm sure rest is also demonized there, just as it is in America, not to compare the USSR with American culture. That's probably not a great thing to do, but you can find similarities in all kinds of things. Yeah, so like I don't necessarily know what to take away with that passage, but it just was so different from what I've seen and thought of in the past that I just kind of wanted to note that. Book overall, what are my thoughts? I think that it would have been better if I read this if I existed in USSR, because then I would have a lot more context to be able to like catch a lot of the satirical notes of this and make that a little bit more enjoyable. I think, this is a book that was really written for that context, because it is a satire and that's the nature of things. I think if like you're someone who is very familiar with that time of history, you could probably get a lot more out of it than what I can. But not to say that like this book is solely dependent on that time of history. Obviously a lot of the themes like you can take away and transfer into now. I'm going to go back to the point that I made about like what is a writer, what is a creative, what is an artist. I think that like that's something that's worth looking at and picking at in general, because during Stalin's reign, it was like, yes, there was poets and writers and novelists and whatnot, but they weren't able to actually be those things to the fullest extent, because like so much of like at least creative writing is going to be about like a freedom of expression, or voicing your own thoughts, or introspection, or critiquing society, or highlighting parts of society, noting the world around you, like all of those kind of things. And you can't do that if you're having to foot someone else's agenda, especially like when it is, a totalitarian regime, for example. And I do think that like that's just an interesting question that the novel in general kind of points out. And there's even like a note with the master where he mentions like, okay, like now that I'm free, what am I going to do? Like, am I going to keep writing and have to live in poverty because it's not for the state? Like, that's the only option. And I'm sure that like the master's kind of a self-insert character of the author, just because like we know that he could not publish this work, and it wasn't published until 20 years after his death or so. Did I enjoy this book? After everything I've said, you might think, yeah, this probably ranked pretty high for you. It's not, actually. Reading it was not fun for me. I think like the narrative style tripped me up a lot, and it could just be my translation, to be fair. I think it was really hard to pick up a lot of satirical moments. I never was really sure, like, is this satire, or like, are we just having a magical realism moment, or is it both? Like, it was just kind of hard to like figure that out. But I did listen to an audiobook version every once in a while, and that made it a little bit easier for me, and that was a different translation. So I think it's very heavily dependent on the translation, the formatting, and also like the context that you're given going into it. So I think for a lot of people, like, this could be a great book. I mean, it is like, it's fun at times, like not always, but it is fun. It wasn't an easy read for me, and not like in a, oh, this is challenging, it's kind of fun, but more of like, I'm dragging my feet through this. I thought this was a medium paced novel. Storygraph said so. Yeah, so like, I think for that reason, just because I didn't have like a great reading experience, it's ranked lower for me. But I do like recognize the merit of this novel, and like, there's a lot that you can pull out of it with themes. I've only done a couple. All to say, it's like, this could really be your cup of tea. It just wasn't my cup of tea. Since last time I kind of like ranted about education, I'm just gonna like just go into a very small anecdote of just liberal arts and humanities matter. It's sad that we continue to devalue liberal arts and humanities and act like it isn't challenging or something worth pursuing. And that's not necessarily the fault of educators, that's not necessarily the fault of employers sometimes. And like, it's just a big old mess of systems in society. So like, that's not like pitting the blame on anyone. It's just like, you know, as someone who is technically a creative, because I am a writer and my degree is in writing, and Leo's hitting around his nail clippers, really ruining the mood. But yeah, so like, you know, I'm coming at this from a biased position, but I do think that like, if there's anything that this novel really proves, is that art matters, and real art matters most. So yeah, we'll end it on that note as Leo continues to hit random objects on the table. It drives me wild all night and day. Our stagnant love feels so cliche. It pains me oh so much, singing this stupid song, knowing you're frolicking here and there. I've had it oh so rough, I think I've had enough of all your lying and cheating. I don't even know where to start. You give me chills, yeah, you're giving me chills, and I'm falling apart, falling apart.